A fundamentalist preacher turned Oklahoma state senator is on a mission to enforce his extreme Christian nationalist beliefs through legislation. Dusty Deevers wants to outlaw porn, criminalize abortion as homicide, and eliminate no-fault divorce. Deevers sees government as a tool to enforce God's will and views society as divided between Christian and satanic forces. He aims to impose his moral values on others, even proposing felony charges for porn viewers. Deevers' radical views have gained national attention, highlighting the threat Christian nationalism poses to democracy. Despite criticism, he remains unapologetic, claiming to act in accordance with Oklahoma Republicans' will. This story is from Rolling Stone by Tim Dickinson on February 2nd, 2024. Jonathan, why don't you start us off? Or no, I'm sorry, Infidel. Let's go to Infidel first. Start us off with this one.
One of the first things that struck me with this article was that Dusty Deevers believes, and I quote, that the government should terrorize evildoers. Now, for me, that just sounds like an admission that you're a terrorist, starting off the top. I mean, according to him, government's sole purpose is to promote what is good in accordance with the will of God. And as you mentioned, Scott, he thinks that, porn should be viewing porn should be a felony up to 20 years, and wanted a bounty system similar to what we have here in Texas, horribly so, on the abortion issue. He wants his neighbors to be reporting their neighbors about, their porn viewing habits. And I couldn't help but think, how invasive is this for anyone to think that not only is it we got to peek under the stall to see what you look like when you're in the bathroom, but now we got to peek through your windows so we can tell on you when you're watching porn. It just absolutely boggles my mind that this person could not only be elected but stay there, because I had to check. I was just curious. Is this guy married? Does he have kids? And yes, he has 6 or 7 kids, and he's married. And my next thought was, poor Mrs. Deevers. But
poor woman. I know.
Yes, absolutely. And and he even wants to criminalize sexting except between spouses. And I'm like, you're going to say that words that people type to each other consensually is as bad as porn? That you should, I mean, I don't have, and I'm not making a judgment on porn, but I understand that there are certain groups of people who have an uptight mentality towards the topic. But Jesus Christ, are you kidding me? Even sexting and eliminating no-fault divorce, I just couldn't help but think how anti-women all of his policies seem to boil down to: abortion being homicide. Once we lock you down into a marriage, you're stuck and you got to stay. It's amazing that this passes for reasonable thought anywhere, even in Oklahoma. I guess I've grown accustomed to hearing this type of behavior and these type of things from people in Florida and here in Texas. I knew Oklahoma was bad, but I didn't know they were going to try to become a subsidiary of Texas or Florida. And with that in mind, I can only hope that people's eyes are open and realize just how absolutely unreasonable, unhinged, and incredibly invasive doing something like this would be. I have no idea how you would stop people from watching porn. But since this is all cutting into my porn time, I figured I'll go ahead and pass this over to you, Jonathan, and see what you have to say about this.
When you get done with yours, you can send it to me, will you? Before it becomes a felony to send it over the internet, right? I don't know where to start with this POS, and you can use your imagination on the term. I'm getting really tired of people trying to sell me a bill of goods that really actually attempts to harm and criminalize normal human rights. seeing government as a means to coerce the public into their dystopian desires of a dictatorship of Christ. I got news, buddy. Christ don't exist. So, mellow out, take a chill pill. I have some I could recommend to you, but there is unceasingly an attempt to victimize and demonize already marginalized people. They wouldn't do it on a majority. They have to attack a minority, some small group of people who aren't doing anything to harm you or society, and demonize them. All for this fantasy attachment to the cherry-picked words of a book of fables from the Mideast Bronze Age, ostensibly compiled in Byblos in Lebanon about 17 to maybe 1900 years ago. And before that, passed for hundreds of years like a game of telephone. So before it was ever written down. And this they think is what they think is a holy thing and is absolutely worth trading in all the liberty, rights, and equality we've gained in the last 2 centuries. So I'm like, Dusty Deevers loudly shouts the quiet part he wants to legislate what, where, and when you believe. To him, the government should use whatever force necessary to uphold his draconian Dark Age mythology. Women should be prosecuted, even face the death penalty for losing a baby or even having a miscarriage. How fucking bad is that? Pardon my language, but damn, where does this guy get from that? He's a deranged individual. He's even hated by mainstream pro-lifers. You have to be really, really bad to get those people afraid of you. You will poison their movement. So the maniac sees the world as a battleground of righteous Christians, only righteous if they agree with him, of course, on all things, and against everything else. I mean, everything. If you're not part of that, then you're evil and need to be destroyed, including the country, if possible. This is beyond anti-democracy, anti-American, anti-republicanism. It's anti-everything we stand for. And a lot of people who died to support it and to keep it. So there's no doubt in my military mind, this guy is a total idiot. We need to better civics education in school and a mandatory class in the history of the separation of religion and government. And that would mean getting into the letters of people like Madison and telling them some of the other literature that displays the mind of the founders. They just left religious wars in the country they came from that killed thousands and thousands of people. And they were trying to prevent that by saying, you can't have a religious government. It has to be secular. So anyway, if you think differently than that, you are dead wrong. Not only that, you've been lied to a lot. Start digging into the actual history and you'll find out what's really going on. I know you won't, but just friendly advice. Educate yourself.
Free of charge.
Free of charge. In the immortal words of an MMA coach I know, fuck this guy. I, of course, would add, and not in a good way, so, that's, Scott, I'm getting vulgar. You might want to take this from me.
Boy, that's a hard act to follow there. And so I'm going to have to crank it up a notch from the vulgarity. So if you'll turn with me in your Bibles to the book of Proverbs, chapter 13 and verse 24, which says, those who spare the rod hate their children, but those who love them are diligent to discipline them. And Dusty Deevers wants to be that rod. He wants to be the shaft that's shoved in and around the face area of America, or perhaps smuggled in through the back door of the legislative process. When we think of horrible pricks, Dusty Deever wants to be damn sure that we think of him. And I tell you, he's off to a great start. So in our last segment for this week, we talked about the dangers of Christian nationalism. Well, here it is. I mean, this is what we're talking about. This is what we're looking at. This is what it looks like. This is what the end of that particular, geez, I hope it doesn't get worse than that. But, this is what's happening. Okay. He wants to put people in jail for watching porn. By the way, Infidel, with your admission there, I think you just won me $10,000, but I'll have to double check on the jurisdiction there. He wants to punish anybody that's involved with an abortion. He wants to force people to stay married against their will. He wants to, and this was good too, he wants to enact what he calls an eye for an eye punishment for people filing false police reports, meaning that he wants the accusers to receive the same punishment as the crime for which they're making the accusation. I don't know this, but I wonder if he happens to have a personal stake in that particular one. But anyway, for him, obviously, it's not about justice or fairness or rehabilitation or any of that stuff. For him, it's all about inflicting pain via punishment. And he said he believes, we talked about this already, he believes the role of government is to protect innocent people and to punish and terrorize evildoers. The suffering is the point to him. So I want to hold this guy up as a warning to Christians. This is the kind of thing that your belief supports. And I know I say this often when I'm on the show, but it's those liberal Christians, the followers of Christ, whatever you want to call it, the softer, lovey-dovey Christianity, you're providing shelter for this kind of belief. If you endorse irrational beliefs in your philosophy, then you are giving tacit approval for other people who have irrational beliefs. And they're maybe not going to be quite so nice as you are. Now, I don't know how else we can say this. If it doesn't persuade you, then I don't know what does. It's hard to imagine what it would take to demonstrate the end game, the results, the consequences of this kind of accepting this type of belief. The article used this word to describe Deevers, and I thought it was really cool. It was Manichaean. I had to look it up. It refers to anything related to Manichaeism, which is a dualistic religion that combines Zoroastrian, Christian, Gnostic, and other beliefs in a theology of a cosmic struggle between good and evil. So he sees himself as a general in the army of God, and you can't get more black and white than that. From the article here, this is a quote from the article. Deevers embodies a threat that experts believe Christian nationalism poses to democracy by literally demonizing his opponents and casting compromise as moral corruption. That's key there. In his eyes, compromise is moral corruption. His intent, he said, is to steer society away from the judgment that we deserve, warning that otherwise the country will suffer not just from the effects of bad policy and wicked rulers, but under the judgment of God. Brad Onishi, author of An Extremist History of a Christian Nation, recently described in an interview with Rolling Stone, if you're a person who is convinced that the United States is under threat by a Luciferian regime comprised of, and here he hits all the buzzwords here, comprised of Marxist, globalists, secularists, feminists, the LGBTQ community, and so on, democracy is not your sacred value. That's it right there. Democracy is not the sacred value here. Infidel, do you have anything to add to that?
I've got plenty to add.
All right, let's hear it. Hear it. Preach to us.
I don't think that Dusty believes in the American form of government. I think that's quite clear. What he wants is something else. And I think that is something that's very important for those people that we've talked about previously, who they become radicalized and they have this view that when Christianity comes to power and we do what God wants us to do, in their mind, what God wants them to do is what they believe is right. And that varies according to individual. You can't even find 10 people in the same church who are going to necessarily agree where those lines are. So when you start allowing someone to make those decisions, to decide what is right and wrong, what you're doing is you're setting yourself up. I don't know how many of you have ever seen Handmaid's Tale, but I've got a sneaking suspicion that there's going to be more than a few people with missing fingers or hanging up on the wall if this ever were to come to fruition, because they're not Christian enough. And the truth is that we've seen this time and again. Christians are savage towards non-Christians, but they can be really savage towards the ones that are their brothers and sisters, supposedly. They can really take them to the cleaners. So they need to be more careful than we are, because we're already labeled. We're no good. We're bad. But when the people who are supposedly on your side betray you, that's even worse in their mind. So be careful what you look for. And one other thing I wanted to point out is that time and again, we hear about people who rally against LGBTQ, and we find out that they've been, having relationships with same-sex relationships, and we're all shocked that this is what happened. We hear people talking about all these things, and we read about, pastors who are sexually abusing and assaulting people in their church. This isn't something new. And so I have to wonder, how long is it before we see Dusty Deevers' Pornhub account and really find out what's going on? Because the truth is that when I was a believer and I was growing up in a very conservative sect, we would go to these different churches and we'd hear these preachers rail against fornication and adultery and homosexuality and all these things they would just completely obsess over. And then 5, 10, 15 years later, you find out, guess what? And he just screams against things a bit too much. Now, he may be a true believer. He may be the real deal, because there are those too. But if he is, I can assure you one thing: he should never do anything inside the political realm, because I don't see how in good faith he could take that oath of office and declare to uphold the Constitution of this country, because what he is standing for is completely opposed to what this country stands for. You don't want to view porn? Then don't view porn. You don't think people should have abortions? Well, don't have abortions. You don't believe in same-sex relationships? Then don't have one. Those are all choices you can make if those are things that you believe you shouldn't do. But when you start crossing in and telling other people that you can't do this and call yourself an American, claim to uphold the Constitution of this country, that is what you call, and I'm going to be very tactful here, that's what you call a liar. Now, having said that, take us away, Jonathan.
Oh, gee. Methinks he does protest too much.
You think?
And I don't mean you, infidel. There's something about Christian nationalism, I think, that the Christian nationalists may not realize. And I actually remember this from one of the rallies they had, and one of the preachers, similar to Deevers, got up and railed against the Catholic Church. And the next person was General Flynn. He's a Catholic, and he says, "I'm a proud Catholic." So you can start seeing the cracks in this already. Like I said, the founders escaped warfare, religious warfare. And now, if one of these people, 6 out of 9 on the Supreme Court are Catholic. If this religious group manages to take power, we're going to have another set of religious wars. It's not about all those people getting our rights stepped on. It'll be about how much they can kill each other in very gruesome ways. And they'll be killing each other, and that's something that's worthy of avoiding by not trying to push your particular version of morality or reality, which isn't reality, but it's, your particular fantasy of what life should be like on the rest of the religious world. I mean, or us atheists. But you start pushing that shit, and what happens is you get pushed back. And the other side is just as adamant as you that they're right. So your guy's going to get into a very nasty mix-up. Just take a look at the 11th through the 16th century, and in European history, okay? And you'll see that there were over, I think the ones I know about, there were 32 crusades. And it's not just the Holy Land. It's Eastern Europe. It's Germany. It's all sorts of places. And they just flat raped and murdered their way into Christianity. And you're going to see that happen once Martin Luther in 1500 or so, and Protestantism. Look at all the hundreds of thousands of people who were murdered with that. And think about that. And all that it proved was that nobody was right. And that's what I wanted to say about that. And again, he does protest too much. So he might start pinging on my gaydar if he keeps doing that.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you think this guy, this Dusty Deevers, do you think he was inevitable? Do you think it was inevitable that that this would is this a product of human nature? Is this a product, were there specific things in history that happened that kind of guided us down this path here? Or what do you think, Infidel? Do you think this was bound to happen eventually?
Calvin.
I think that it is absolutely inevitable when you start moving that line away from freedom and start going in the method of fascism. It becomes a one-up, because things that were once completely unreasonable, that you knew were absolutely unhinged, become reasonable now. Because in the backdrop of the whole anti-LGBTQ scenario, the whole anti-women's rights fiasco, all these things, I think, have emboldened them to the point where all the other things that they used to whisper among themselves in their echo chambers, that's what we're starting to see bubble out. Because I don't know if you remember this, but 30 years ago, or actually more than that, 40 years ago, I'm old. I remember my dad getting these things from what was Perkins Group. They used to go out there and stand out in front of, 7-Elevens and things, protesting adult magazines behind the counter. And that kind of faded away with the advent of the internet and things like that. People have kind of, moved away, but I don't think that the viewpoint that was behind it ever went away. And that is exactly what we're seeing here. We're seeing those people who they don't have to stand in front of abortion clinics because they've already criminalized that, and they think they're winning every other debate. And I think they're saying, okay, let's go on to new territory. Let's find a new thing that we can rant about that'll get attention and get me elected. And I don't think they care about the consequences. I think the consequences are completely inconsequential to them. Jonathan?
Again, answer my question. Do you think this was inevitable, or do you think there were specific things in history that kind of led us this way, or was it just a product of human nature?
I think that I don't think it's human nature. I think it's a product of society in general. I also think that it's inevitable when people become convinced that they're being downtrodden. They have several reactions they can take. A lot of them turn to religion, and sometimes they turn to the most extreme form of it. Like death cults, like the resurrection shit, or the ones where they fall into, we need to take over the government so that we can stop being, this oppressed, quote unquote, group, which is not true. Christians are not oppressed in this country. They are in charge of this country. So, I'm kind of like,
sure about that? Are you sure about that? Because they have to sell cakes to gay couples, right?
I know that is bad. Yeah. Well, that's a whole nother thing that we've done before on here. But I'm just thinking to myself that, it's inevitable. This is going to evolve out of a complex society and Alvin Toffler's future shock, add that to a religious upbringing, and they have to get more extreme. As we said in the last article, they're getting hardened, meaning they have to get more and more extreme because they're losing ground every year. And they may not know this, but unconsciously they feel it happening. And they know that their culture, what they want it to be, because it never was the real culture, but their fantasy of what the culture is diminishing and fading away. Not fast enough, but hopefully before they do any real damage.
All right. Well, that's a great place for us to end this conversation. I appreciate everything that both of you had to contribute. And if you want to see more of what we have to say, then just click right up here.